evening and welcome to the Bible Speaks. Do you realize I've been sitting here for almost half an hour waiting to say that? Because we had a technical glitch in the control room and the boffins were busy working on it while I studied and restudied my script. Have you ever had one of those days where your contacts reject you? You know, like your kids do sometimes? Today's one of those days. I've been wearing my spectacles all day, and obviously to be able to read my script in the tiny print on my tablet, I have to take them off. And of course now the monitor over there is a blur. So if I'm not looking at the right camera, or if I miss the visual cues from the control room, who is also a blur, maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. Forgive me. And if you tuned in tonight expecting to see part the second of the Jebusites, you're going to be a little disappointed, because I have a confession to make. I started this program, or the series of programs, with the idea that we'd describe the land of Canaan and then we'd describe the peoples in it. And for some reason or other, when I started last week with the Hittites, or the week before, I forget which one it was, I completely forgot that I'd got a preparatory program leading into that. I mean, nice to have so many scripts on your computer you can't remember which one is which. So, rather than wait until the end and then go back to the beginning, if you see what I mean, tonight, as you saw on the titles, if you look at the titles, and I'm sure some of you do, we're starting where we should have started, with Canaan in the Bible. In other words, what does the Bible say today about Canaan? Okay, so we're going to go right back to Genesis. Don't you love that, going back into Genesis, the root of all our knowledge and everything? Okay, and the Bible tells us, and by the way, if you've got something to add to these programs the next 2 or 3 weeks, by all means, drop me an email or something, because I'm always interested to hear somebody else's opinion. Lord knows I get enough of it from the crew from time to time. But anyway, the Bible tells us that God commanded Abram, who later became Abraham, of course, but you knew that. And the words in Genesis 12 are, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. What's interesting about this passage is, and we're going to go through this in some detail, is it doesn't actually tell him where to go. We have to assume that in God's conversation with Abraham, he implied or gave him the knowledge of where to go. Because if you consider where Abraham was in Ur of the Chaldees is right down the bottom by the Euphrates Basin, and of course Canaan is up at the top of the Middle East, map of the Middle East, I mean. So, you know, it's like, yeah, that's it. Oh, please excuse me. That's fine, God, but whereabouts do you want me to go? But we're soon told, all right? And here's the interesting part. You need to read sometimes between the lines here. Abraham took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and I guess he was looking after his brother's son for some reason or other, and all the possessions they had gathered, which makes sense. But here's the next line. And the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. Persons they had acquired. In other words, people they had bought, or bargained for, or bartered for. In other words, slaves. So right at the very beginning of the whole Israelite saga, slaves and slavery are right there in the middle of it. Something that Christians today kind of gloss over, you know, oh, we don't believe in slavery. Well, the old Israelites did. Okay. So, and then they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. Now, of course, we know what it was in 12:5. And they came to the land of Canaan, which we know today as the land of Israel, okay? And this begins this long interaction of Abraham and his descendants, who are the future people of Israel, with the land of Canaan, which is the future land of Israel. And what we're going to look at is who was actually living there in the land of Canaan at the time, both as reflected in the Bible and the writings of the ancient Near East. There are some existing writings around that time, okay? So first of all, we'll look at Canaan in the Noah account. Go back to Genesis and look at the story of Noah. And refers to the land as Canaan. It sounds pretty straightforward. But it turns out that the details of who lived in the land and who owned the land before the Israelites are extremely complicated. You have to understand, we didn't have cars and houses and all the other trappings of modern civilization. Owning land was the wealth, unless you had a gold mine, or I guess they didn't have oil wells in those days, but you know, that sort of thing. Unless you had something else that was valuable, like salt flats or herds and herds of cattle, land was what it's about. And people aren't about to give up their land. If you suddenly got 10,000 people moved into Latonia here and said, okay, we're refugees, we're going to live here and we'd like your houses, you probably might resist them just a little bit, okay? So let's look and see what we know about the Canaanites, and you'll see as we go through these programs why I kind of jumped the gun with talking about the Hittites and the Jebusites, because they pop up here. Okay? And there's the two earliest references we have. The earliest reference period we have in the Bible occur in the Noah account, and the first of them is in Genesis Genesis chapter 9, verse 22. In that, Canaan is a person, the youngest son of Ham. Remember Ham, one of Noah's sons? Not a nation, a person. That's the first reference. In that story there, in Genesis 9, it says Ham, the father of Canaan, shames the drunken Noah. You remember, you know, they went in his tent, covered him up and that sort of thing, and causes his son to be cursed. In verse 25 it says, cursed be Canaan, lowest of the slaves shall he be to his brothers. In other words, he's lost everything, he's down at the bottom end. And it always occurred to me, I hadn't read this in great detail until a few years ago when I was doing some studies on something else. Ham was the one who committed the offense. So why does Canaan get blamed? It's kind of one of those odd biblical things that daddy does wrong and eldest son carries the can for it. There you go. The second of those mentions of Canaan is in what we call, what scholars call, the Table of Nations in chapter 10. This is that all-encompassing family tree of Noah's descendants, who are the ancestors of all the nations of the world, if you take the Bible account. Okay, within that genealogy listing, Canaan's listed in really special detail. And I'll read it out to you. And the sons of Ham, so were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And then Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and listen to this, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and Hamathites. So all those names, and remember them because we'll ask questions later, but remember them for later on, all came from the line of Ham, okay? Afterwards, of course, the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon, which they say is in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, it's right up there, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admath, and Zeboim, down the bottom end. And that's in Genesis 10 and Genesis 15, if you care to look, and I'm sure you will. However, as always happens in Bible studies, however, all this demographic and geographic, detail, this person, that person, there and there and there, there's no indication in the text of what special role the Canaanites and their land are destined to play. You would think, since the founding fathers were so keen to get all this down in writing, or in verbal memory, passed on until eventually it got put into writing, you'd think that if Canaan was that special, they'd have made a much more stronger emphasis of it, okay? And there is a special role that the Canaanites and their land play in the continuing story. It's just one of those frustrating things when you study the Bible, that it jumps from here to there, says something here and then doesn't mention it again. And you think, well, what happened there, So Abraham arrives in Canaan, okay? And he enters Canaan, it says in the Bible, and camps by the oak of Moreh, near Shechem. Remember, we talked about Shechem in some programs last year. And at this point, it's kind of one of those things. It looks like it might have been added, I don't know, but it says near Shechem. And at that point, the Canaanite was then in the land. Okay? So it's their land, why wouldn't they be? But anyway, it makes the point. The Canaanites are still there, and then God appears to Abraham and says, to your offspring I'll give this land. Again, we're not told exactly what land this is. That land, this land, all the land. It doesn't give you enough details. I mean, God repeats the promise to Abraham in chapter 15. And then it goes on to say that after setting up an array of cut-up animals, kind of gruesome, Abraham falls asleep, and in his sleep he has a vision of God who tells him of Abraham's descendants, of the slavery of the people, and the release. Okay? So he foretells him of the capture in Egypt, the slavery in Egypt, and the release, and ends up by saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. If you look on your map, and I'm sure you've got that handy, but if you look at your map, that's quite a big area. To the land of the Kenites, the Kerizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, the Amorites, of course we mentioned those before, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now there's a bunch of people in there we didn't hear of before. Where did they suddenly come from? Anyway, so God's promise has now been defined, at least within specific parameters. Okay, both geographic and ethnic. But even then, and I'm not trying to be terribly nitpicky about it, but these parameters are still far from clear. Still not exactly clear. From an ethnic point of view, the land is said to be inhabited by a group of nations that come under the general heading of Canaanite. In other words, if you like, this is Canaan and the Canaanites, but forming all that are all these other people. So who are the Canaanites? I mean, in fact, these nations of Canaan are listed about 20 times in the Bible. I think I counted 20 times. If I'm wrong, I'm sure you're going to email me and tell me. And the lists differ from each other. Not just in one or two, but quite dramatically. Let's say, pick an example here. For example, in the thing I mentioned earlier, the Table of Nations in Genesis, which pictures all of humanity descended from Noah and his 3 sons. Canaan is the son of Ham, okay? And the rest of the Canaanite nations, 11 in number it mentions in that list, are descended from him. Okay, well, that makes sense. However, in another list, same source, the Bible, the Canaanites are simply one of a list of 10 nations. So they're not the chief thing about everybody else comes underneath. They're just one of them. Not only that, but of the 12 in the nations listing, there's only 10. And of that, only 5 appear in both texts. So why don't we mention these chaps in this thing, and why didn't... Very, very, very different. And in fact, if you look through the whole Bible on these listing things, and as I said, there's about 20 times throughout the whole Bible, we find a total... Now, I must admit, I didn't sweat through all 20 lists to get this. I actually read a source and went to the source. But we find a total of 14 names, 14 different families or nations or tribes, or call them what you will, which usually appear in different times in groups of 6 or 7. So this list has this 6, that list has 7 listing in it, and 3 of them are from that list and 4 of them are from that. It's totally confusing. Scholars still haven't figured it out. So who were these Canaanites? I mean, okay, they're the sons of Ham. Well, hang on. They're not listed here or not listed there. And they're not listed as the number 1 guy here. Okay? In just a few chapters later on in the Bible, in Genesis 24, well, it's not a few, it's 10 or 12, but we read how Abraham sent his servant back to Haran. They just come from there, remember? Well, not just, but that's where they came from. To find a servant for his son Isaac. Okay? And the reason he's doing that, surprisingly, is that Isaac will not end up marrying a Canaanite. Read Genesis 24:3. Okay? Then want some more proof about it? Let's look at Rebekah, who also insisted that her son Jacob, okay, be sent to Haran, again back to Haran. Obviously they had a good supply of women in Haran or something, rather than marry the daughters of Heth, Genesis 27. Which Isaac restates as, in other words, Isaac says it again after Rebekah had said it, but he says, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Genesis 28. This is not just scholarly input, this is all straight out of Genesis, all right? So, they're in the land of the Canaanites, surrounded by them, one assumes, and yet they can't take any brides from that country. What got me confused is, what is a daughter of Heth? Is a daughter of Heth the same as the daughter of a Canaanite? Is a Hethite a kind of Canaanite? That's implied in Genesis 10. Are they a separate nation, as implied in Genesis 15? Are they synonyms? In other words, is the same name for both? And why the big change in terms? It's very difficult. Are they descendants of the Hittites or the Amorites? It's just difficult. It really is. And during the promise, referencing the part of what I've just been talking about, God tells Abraham that although his descendants will inherit the land, they will have to wait 4 generations because, and I refer you to Genesis 15, by now you've got your Bibles out because you know I'm quoting from it, okay, that the sin of the Amorite is not yet complete. And this term is using the word the Amorite as a general term for the inhabitants of the land. Rebekah calls them Hittites. Isaac uses Canaanites. Similarly, go back to chapter 23. The inhabitants of Hebron, okay, from whom Abraham buys the cave, remember he buys the cave of Machpelah, okay, are called the sons of Heth. By the way, the specific owner of the cave, even more confusion, is Ephron the Hittite. Whereas if you read Joshua 10, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, and the other cities in southern Canaan that Joshua defeats in the march of the Israelites into Canaan are called the kings of the Amorites. This is the title used of Sihon and Og, who the 2 Transjordan kings that Moses defeated. In fact, as far as I can see, the most frequently mentioned name after Canaanite is Amorite, almost as though this was the default identity of any Canaanite. Let's say you call the people who live in this area around the church Covingtonites, all right? And in amongst them are the Latoniaites. In other words, the same people living in the same area, but but some people call them Latoniaites and some people call them Covingtonites. I think that's more likely way it was, but as I say, that's guesswork because I don't know. And you know, almost as if, as I said, the default identity of any Canaanite who wasn't known by another name is the way I'm looking at it. I mean, such as maybe Jebusite or Hittite or something. If you didn't know that he was, like I said, from Covington and Latonia, if you didn't know he was from Latonia, then he's from the Covington area. You would be a general default name. And if this wasn't confusing enough, it really does get confusing. When the prophet Ezekiel, got to go to Ezekiel now, describes the origins of Jerusalem, he uses all three terms. You don't believe me? Thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Okay? Your father was an Amorite, second subdivision, and your mother a Hittite, another subdivision. That's Ezekiel 16, if your Bible's handy. What does Ezekiel mean by this claim? Does he have a specific historical situation in hand? I mean, was he just comparing the sinful inhabitants of the Jerusalem he knew to the long ago sinful predecessors, ancestors? It's an interesting point, because would he have considered Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, priest of the highest God, which is, as I say, of Jerusalem, who appears to be one of these sinful Amorites? It's fascinating once you get into it. In Genesis 12:6, we're told the Canaanite was then in the land. However, in Genesis 13:7, we're informed that the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then living in the land. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because the Perizzites are listed in chapter 15, the later chapter, but not in chapter 10. And all scholars can suppose is that the Perizzites must be another name for one of the groups of people that are listed in chapter 10. Maybe, you know, and it may be that the information is written by different people at different times, and times have changed, or more information is available. Okay? I mean, to all this evidence, to all that I've mentioned before, you could add many more references to the peoples of Canaan, and each one would give you a slightly different picture of who actually inhabited the land. So the picture we get is very confused. It is. Now, I understand that if you're just reading the Bible as a faith document, just looking at the history, you really don't care that much. But a lot of the things that happened in the early parts of the Bible color the way the Israelites of later years thought about other people, how they treated other people, which ones they brought into their under their wing and which ones they didn't, which ones they fought against, which ones they made treaties with. So it's interesting to know this. The more you know about the background to your faith, the better you know your faith, I suppose. The land was inhabited by the Canaanites, who were composed of several different groups, one of whom was the Canaanites. Amorites, Hittites, and many others are mentioned, but there's not, what's hard for scholars, there's not a lot of consistency there. There's not a lot of, you know, who said what, oh, that they're following a line. In the use of the various groups, okay? And it's here that you probably want to look at the real life context of the Bible, you know, to try and figure out what was really happening. And we have to do that, we have to look at external evidence to fill in the missing pieces. In the 19th century, you know, Western scholars started to decipher the ancient languages of the Middle East. You know, they found the tablets and the translations and all that, and began to look at the records of all sorts of people, began to understand the languages and began to read what predominantly the writings of ancient Egypt and Babylon and some of Assyria and other people. I mentioned the Hittites a few programs ago. But when they did, a kind of whole new world came to light, because much of what they discovered seemed to remind them, and you can, if you compare the two sources, you can see it, of what they read of the Bible. But a lot of it was different from what they understood. For example, it turned out that Canaan was indeed a name that could be used for what later became the land of Israel, but only with a rather limited context. During the 16th to the 12th centuries BCE, before Christ, at which time the land was part of the Egyptian Empire. Now, they've just shown me the shut up and get off sign. It doesn't actually say that, but I know what it means. So we're going to leave it there. I will point out that different scholars have developed different theories about the origin and the original meaning of the name Canaan. So I'll leave you on that note, and we'll pick it up next week when we go back and decide more of this, all right? Until then, go back and read Genesis. Well, you can read all the way through, of course, but read Genesis 10 through 27, 28. See if you can pick up what I'm talking about, all right? As always, keep your Bible handy. Good night, God bless.